Let me introduce to you our David Holm, CEO and founder of Exigent Group. David is a qualified KPMG ACA and provides commercial direction to Exigent's global clients. He does that by drawing on his experience of being a board director on more than 50 organizations and having been in the industry for a very long time. For Exigent's clients, he helps identify growth opportunities and has a great track record of getting top and bottom line results for them. Please do tap into his knowledge during the webinar, with your questions, and even after this session. Over to you, David.
Thanks, Gordon, and welcome to everybody around the world. I think we've got representation from Australia, Europe, UK, Canada, and the US. So welcome everybody, and for those that are staying up late, hopefully we won't put you to sleep. So firstly, just a very brief introduction to John Albright. John is General Counsel for Hub International. For those that don't know Hub as a brand, it's I think the 8th or 9th largest insurance broker in the world, and the 4th largest in North America. And naturally, as an insurance business, it is rather founded on statistics and data. John's, by background, also an engineer and rocket scientist, I believe. And John, maybe you could say a few words about your sort of background and introduce yourself to the audience.
Sure. Good morning, afternoon, and good evening, I guess I should say to the audience. I've spent really the better part of 15 years in and around analytics. Going back to 2001, I was part of Accenture's BPO business, and if you look at how business process outsourcing is scoped and contracted, you're analyzing historical cost and headcount to project future delivery cost. So again, foundation in analytics. From there, I spent about 7 years with a global market research and analytics firm focusing on the consumer packaged goods space. So everything that people buy in grocery stores and drugstores of that nature.
Is that IRI?
That's IRI, yes. And then, as you alluded to, in insurance, I mean, underwriting is the backbone of our industry, and that is analytics. You're using large pools of data to assess and predict future risk. So something I think all of us live with at some level, but depending on the industry you're in, it may be more front and center.
Right. Thanks, John. So if we just move on to the agenda, just quickly to talk people through where we've been and where we're going to. For quite a number of the audience, we'll know this. We've had 2 webinars already, not about analytics, but about putting together a contract strategy which will allow you to make better decisions and deploy analytics. Just as as a bit of background from the pre-webinar questions, between 74% of the audience do not believe they have an effective contract management strategy, but 84% of people think that it's a great asset to be monetized. Were you surprised by those results, John?
Not at all. I think people see and appreciate the value. It's figuring out how to tap into that value. That is the bridge. I think people are trying to better understand.
I mean, if people do want those previous webinars, they are available online. So feel free to tap into that knowledge from other participants. So really today we're just going to complete the journey really by saying how do we now use that information. And the next slide, Gordon, if you could just take us onto that, gives us some more data which really is the foundation stone of what we would call a return on investment really. Obviously everyone can see those stats. John, conclusions from the journey so far? I mean, this is really the basis of an ROI, isn't it?
Yeah, these are the building blocks, and you have to map these to your specific company and your specific industry. But you know, building on these, I saw a stat. Gosh, it's a couple of years old now, where the cost of ineffective controls and contract management costs U.S. companies over $150 billion. So the money is there, and it's really lost opportunity. So any dollar you're able to recover through effective contract management goes directly to the bottom line.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, isn't it? And that's the key thing. It goes to the bottom line. This isn't about squeezing more profit out. This is, you know, enforcing those obligations. Another piece of information that we dug up was that, roughly speaking, in-house legal alone, around 50 billion a year is spent drafting and maintaining contracts, and less than 10% of that is spent enforcing them, which seems to me to be the wrong way around.
It kind of goes to that historical precedent. I mean, we have always been tasked with drafting and contracting the documents themselves. I think the next frontier that we're talking about today is turning the legal department into a profit center.
Yeah.
So how do we then turn around once the contract is signed? How do we then turn around and more effectively monetize those contracts?
That sort of is an interesting question. Then, John, just brings me on to a different point, though, which is, where does the responsibility lie for contract management, and therefore, sort of with that, analytics. I mean, we've seen stats that seem to have a sort of three-way split between finance, procurement, and legal, but it's a confusing picture. So, do you think that's part of the challenge for people? I mean, if you're looking at, say, the last three organizations you've been in, what's worked best?
Well, it varies. I mean, every organization has a different infrastructure. I think the most effective contract management is a partnership. I think if any one of those three verticals, which are common players in the mix, try to do it in a vacuum, they'd get a less effective result. So if you look at procurement, if it's a vendor agreement, they probably have, and you have a fully fleshed out procurement function, they probably have a significant role in contract management.
Yeah.
And in the analysis of contracts from a value and an efficiency standpoint.
Yeah.
You go beyond that, you get into commercial contracts, which is a whole nother avenue of opportunity. Obviously, procurement isn't going to touch that. So that's in the companies I've been a part of, kind of a mix between contract management, if they have a dedicated function.
Yeah.
A lot of companies do not, and finance. And I think that's in both of those two verticals, there's an opportunity for legal to step in, in either lead or partner in that effort.
But don't you think, John, one of the sort of real challenges is when legal creates a contract, they create it in a format of PDF or Word or whatever. Extracting that data, if you don't extract it at the time of the contract, becomes a challenge doing it historically.
Well, you have to have a platform, and that kind of gets into the contract management piece of it.
Yeah.
You've got to have a tool that allows you to analyze the contracts and extract the data. And that can be something as simple as an Excel spreadsheet, which is obviously a highly manual process where you have folks pulling data out of PDFs or Word documents, whatever they may be, and putting those into a spreadsheet, or a more robust contract management tool, offered by companies like Exigent, that there will be some indexing as a part of the overall service offering, extracting that data in. But the tool is far more powerful from an ability to analyze and generate reports from that data.
Actually, just if we could move on, Gordon, to the next slide, maybe just a kind of a brief definition of analytics, really, which is what we've got next. One of the interesting things that we've come across, and this is a new question, John, so this is where I get advice from you. So this is the free bit. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been working with a firm that's quite confused by what analytics are, and the legal team are saying, well, we want analytics, we want legal analytics. What are they? And it's all very well, you've got these fantastic commercial analytics, but we want the legal analytics first. What do you think legal analytics, what do you think the distinction is?
Well, analytics is, having spent a number of years at a data and analytics company, you could have walked through the halls and asked 5 different very informed people. The buzzwords big data, sure everyone's heard that, and analytics, and you'd have gotten potentially 5 different answers, depending on where their focus was in the industry. If you're looking at legal analytics, I think lawyers have been closer to analytics in their company than probably a lot of other folks in it. Anyone who's used an e-billing system and has analyzed historic spend in an effort to project future spend, or has analyzed average billable rates in an effort to negotiate rates, that's analytics.
Yeah.
So if folks on the call think that they've never used it, they may be surprised to learn that they probably use it far more frequently than they anticipated.
Yeah, I was actually at a conference last night, and somebody was speculating that legal analytics was sort of going back through, say, history of litigation, and then applying the history of litigation, contract litigation, and saying whether, how you should negotiate contracts. It's an informed negotiation process, and they saw that as legal analytics rather than commercial. I don't see there's much of a distinction personally, but what's your opinion?
Well, you're not going to, I guess when you're negotiating a contract, you're generally, at least from my view, you're trying to hedge against future risk through indemnities and things of that nature. I don't know that you can eliminate claims purely through contracting because you can't predict the future. But yeah, a big part of legal analytics, I kind of focused in on the e-billing piece because it's very easy to grasp for anyone that's seen an e-billing tool. But we're in the insurance business, so claims management is a significant part of what we do, and we are projecting at the outset of every year, an estimated anticipation of claims.
Yeah.
And we're using analytics to do that. Now, those are adjusted up and down in real time based on actual claim activity, but we go into each year with a budgeted claims analysis. Doing it at a contract level, I think the value there is understanding where the potential risks are and contracting to try to address those risks, either through an agreed resolution process, a liquidated damages provision, or something along those lines.
Right.
But yeah, I could see where they would define that as legal analytics.
So maybe we could just move on to the next slide. I mean, that comes down to the nub of this question, which is the sort of Moneyball meets contract type theme. John, I know you made Mrs. Albright sit through Moneyball at the weekend. I'm sure she enjoyed it. It being a sports movie, but
it had Brad Pitt in it, so that helped.
And I think it's the only movie where he's actually acted, but that's a different question. So that's an interesting point. It's like you're talking about those clauses from experience, or are you talking about analysing the actual data behind why you should bother with that clause?
Well, if you have the data, you could analyze it, right?
Yeah.
There probably aren't very many companies out there that have that data. And then if you're looking at a contract to acquire office supplies or something basic like that, you would probably need some broader market data, have data that was of any real value if you're looking at trying to predict exposure tied to that contract. Maybe the more logical way to look at it, and I know we're going to get into this in some examples further on, is when you're looking at the contract mechanisms themselves, fees and those types of things, you can really get into analytics to try to optimize your spend relative to payment terms and other elements of that.
Yeah.
Trying to predict risk out of contracts, yeah, sure, you can do it, but if you're just getting into analytics, you're certainly jumping into the deep end.
So would your advice be to start now, or to analyze your historical data to start now? I mean, I think that's the challenge for a lot of people, is they don't have much of the data right now. But is that a reason for not starting, I suppose, is the question.
Well, starting now would be, yeah, I think a great idea. But you have to first off get the platform.
Yeah.
Anywhere from, for all of your contracts, anywhere from SharePoint on to, there are Cadillac versions of contract management tools out there, and understand the capabilities of that platform to extract, generate reports, and analyze data. Because until you have that data in an accessible pool, you really don't have a platform for analytics.
Well, you've got no chance, have you?
Right.
I mean, you can't aggregate the data if you don't disaggregate it first. It's that. I think that's one of the lessons. If you look at maybe the next slide, Gordon, really, if the problem that they faced in Moneyball was that nobody had collected the data until. Well, actually, they had. That's not quite true. None of them had used the data. So it's sabermetrics is what it's called. Is that right, Tony? You're the baseball expert. I'm just an English.
To call me a baseball expert is generous, but yeah, sabermetrics is basically a fancy word for using analytics to analyze baseball statistics. And if you rewatch that movie, when they were not faring too well early in the season, one of the comments made was, well, we haven't analyzed enough data. And there's some truth to that, because the more data you analyze, theoretically, the more accurate your insights should be.
And interestingly, one of the points that you've made, I think, before is they didn't just analyze the data on their own team, they analyzed the data from the marketplace. And that's what this slide is all about, really. And so what you're saying is, I mean, that's an interesting point. The question was, it wasn't that they weren't using the data, they weren't using enough data.
Well, and you look at the data they analyzed. I mean, it's easy to compare this movie with another baseball movie, Trouble with the Curve, which had Clint Eastwood as an old school scout, and that was what Moneyball was displacing. You know, the gut of the scout, going out looking at these farm leagues and identifying athletes that had the most potential. What Moneyball did, instead of looking at batting averages, RBIs, some of the routine stats that you see on the back of a baseball card, they looked at how many times did the guy get on base. And there was one that they profiled. He wasn't a particularly good hitter. He got walked as much as Barry Bonds, who was obviously intentionally walked a lot. So his batting average wasn't necessarily great, but he got on base. So you've got to identify, when you're looking at a body of data, what should I be looking at? Once you have the data, that's your next step.
Yeah.
Should I be looking at the incremental cost of payment terms moving from 30 to 60 days? And if I look at that, what is the downfall for asking for 60 days? Because there's a cost of capital in there that obviously your company has and the vendor has. So that's, if you learn anything from Moneyball, it's not only did they turn the process of baseball on its end, but they were looking at different things that actually brought them better end results.
Or better decisions.
Or better decisions.
Yeah. I mean, so sort of, if we go on to the next slide, really one of the things that is really interesting about that is that people already do analytics already. And I think you made the point that attorneys in-house currently are doing a lot of those kinds of things already, naturally. Even if you're thinking about your own personal life, you're always doing analytics. Is that not true? You're constantly thinking, well, if I'm moving into a new apartment, I might not think of it in cost per square foot, but actually I am. I'm looking at capacity. I'm doing that calculation sort of in my head. And do you think that kind of attorneys' teams or GCs' teams, do you think they think like that, or do you think they think it's somebody else's responsibility?
Whether consciously or not, I think they think like that. I mean, any attorney that has ever done a legal budget and has a litigation accrual in it, that's for future litigation, right? So they're using historical data to project what their litigation needs. How many employment practices liability claims am I going to get on average in a year, just as an example. I think lawyers, due to the nature of our job, probably use analytics certainly on a weekly basis.
So just as a takeaway before we go on to the straw poll, so far really I think what you're saying to the audience is kind of don't be afraid of it. Start now. Start collecting data. Select a relevant and cost-effective tool, but don't be afraid of starting with analytics now. Don't think it's a huge job that you have to sort of tackle using legacy data and all of that kind of thing. You don't necessarily have to do that. Are those the sort of takeaways that you would advise the audience so far? Or?
Definitely, and to me, it's relational. If you're already doing it, even if you're baby stepping it, we're obviously talking about taking it up several notches to bigger data sets, to bigger insights, to insights that ideally drive actual bottom line profit to your companies. But yes, you should not be intimidated by it.
So I think we've got a straw poll coming up now. If the audience could take 2 minutes to have a look at that. I won't read it out. Everyone can read, I'm sure, and take a vote. John, where do you think? Where's your money, Paul? Where's your money on this?
Well, to unlock the value of the contract portfolio, my guess is that number is pretty low. If it was more general as how many people are using analytics, I think that would be higher. This one, I'm guessing, is less than 20%.
Yeah. I mean, I hate to agree with you, but it does depend, doesn't it? So, we rarely see firms that are genuinely using analytics in a formal way. There's lots, as you say, that use it in an oblique fashion, and I think they're starting to get the results in pretty quickly, actually. So 19% say yes, which probably comes back to some of the e-billing points, but sort of a massive 62% say no, and some aren't quite sure. Why do you think people aren't quite sure? Do you think that's that confusion of where it lies or who it should lie with?
Well, they may not own it.
Right.
It's if you have a procurement department, odds are they're doing this at some level.
We asked a question in the previous session, actually, with an online poll, and we asked about whether the collaboration between departments was a number of factors. Was positive, negative, and then they had their own description. And 1% voted for apocalyptic, which I thought was quite impressive. So but the core of this, I think, one of your recommendations, really, I think you were saying was, that collaboration is the key to success here, to building an effective strategy.
Without a doubt. And if you can partner on this, you're going to be far more effective, and it's going to be more influential in getting it more broadly disseminated across your organization.
So if we look on the next slide to sort of how, I mean, we set this out as 5. This is the sort of exigent way of thinking about it to make it less intimidating for people, which really comes back to part of the point you made, which is first you've got to extract the data, and that in itself is kind of a challenge in itself, and then you've got to collate and calculate before you even think about comparing. The actual insight comes at the end, but in a funny sort of way. Here's how we think about it. You really ask the question as to why you're extracting it. What better decision do you want to make? Can you think of examples where do you think like that, or is that just a sort of consulting speak?
Well, you have to know what to extract.
Yeah.
It goes back to the Moneyball example. Do I want to look at batting average, or do I want to look at how many times the player got on base?
Yeah.
So once you identify what you think is going to be the most valuable data set, that really is the foundation on which your success or failure is built.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the pieces of work that we've been doing together, which I think we were both surprised about, was on a portfolio of contracts of 400 and something, 420, and we, rather than go for extracting small amounts of data, we've extracted 160 data points. Excuse me, which means suddenly you've got 67,000 data points to compare, contrast, mold, and play with. That was a total surprise to me.
It was a shock to me as well. It's mind-numbing how quickly this data can add up, and that is just looking at our corporate universe. So if you start to combine that with market data, you're quickly into the many millions of data points.
What would your advice be to the audience in terms of that extraction strategy? Would you go for, while you're doing it, do it all, or do as much as possible, assuming that you can use it in the future? How would you advise people to extract that data?
It depends on how evolved your organization is from a tools and capability standpoint, and from a cultural standpoint in using analytics. If it's relatively new, which I think for a lot of companies it might be, if you're looking at it from a contract management context, you need some early wins. So start small, start with vendor agreements. Your commercial agreements probably present a much larger opportunity, but there's probably more complexity there, and there's generally a little more politics there as well. So maybe you start with the vendor agreements. If you, in our world, we started with leases, which was the body of contracts you're talking about. So if you can even narrow it down a little further within your world of vendor agreements, you're going to have a more manageable data set to play with.
Just talking a bit more about that, John, one of the things that's been really interesting in working with you on that is your view that don't just think of the data set as just being contracts. So if you're looking at occupancy level, you need to tie in other sources.
Well, we are, as we build out the tools we're using for that, we've got all the leases on a platform now. We've got the 68,000 data points you referenced. You know, our next step is tying that database into our ERP so we can get true cost of occupancy. There's taxes, there's a host of other things that may not be coded as traditional rent or may not even be codified in the contract. So we're pulling that in so that we understand our true cost of occupancy. And then we're pulling in, you know, headcount. And I think the next step, logically, is to try to understand what those headcount are doing.
Yeah.
So like any HRIS system, you're going to have employment categories that have a general description associated with them, and people will be slotted into one of those. So when we're looking at office space, we have a large office in Midtown Manhattan.
Yeah.
It's probably among our most expensive per square foot, expensive per employee, whatever metric you would historically use. We obviously have clients that expect us to have a presence in Manhattan, but do all of those people there need to be in Manhattan, or could some of them work as equally efficiently in, you know, one of our offices in Long Island or northern New Jersey, where your cost of occupancy is less? So this is where you start to get into understanding where your spend is, why you're spending it there, and where are there opportunities to maybe drive costs down. And, you know, the easy things to look at are cost per square foot relative to the market.
Yeah.
Number of employees per square foot. You know, that's we've gone from, I guess, if you look at what a lot of the law firms in Chicago are doing, they're going to single-size offices, which are more akin to the size of an associate office than a partner office. So you're where you had 2 employees in a cube, you may have 3 employees. Those are logical, and you should be doing that. But you can take the analytics beyond that.
Yeah.
Are there people I can move to another location that may drive even additional savings?
So the question you started out with was really what should people be doing in our most expensive office space? In a sense, that's the simple question, and then you use the data to start thinking about how you best make that decision.
Exactly, and again, we're not inventing this. If you look at when the financial crisis hit in 2008, a lot of the big banks started to move people down to, you know, just picking a geography, Jacksonville, Florida. It was that back office, it was that support, and they've kept them there. So the economy's recovered, but it's logical when you can have someone in $12 a square foot office space to not have them in $50 square foot office space.
I mean, even from that piece of work, we've seen some anomalies where we've run the data and run the analytics that show some quite strange anomalies. So you kind of, that then also acts as a kind of a check, doesn't it? It's a sort of why have we got these differences? What's standing out for me? And therefore, we should investigate those differences and as well as make decisions.
That's right. And you know, coming into this, just looking at a hub corporate data set, I was a little skeptical as to how valuable the insights would be, because you can't benchmark New York against New Mexico. But I was surprised to see that, well, New Mexico was closer in price to New York than maybe we anticipated. So we now know the questions to ask, and there may be a perfectly logical explanation for that. But if you look at average cost in real estate markets, you know, Albuquerque is a more cost-effective or more affordable market than Manhattan is. Yeah. So you're not necessarily gonna get to a changeable result every time, but you are at least now asking the right questions.
Yeah. Gordon, maybe we could just move on to the next slide. As I'm keen to make sure we keep on time. because we could talk about this all day, John. So just a simple example which you referenced earlier, which is a real example from a real client paying 12 million per annum, and just by moving out the payment terms by 30 days, they had a $1 million reward. I know the point you're going to make, I think, which is sometimes you win some and you lose some, but there's probably a price to be paid for that. The question is it worth it?
Well, and this is where it's having spent some time in the automotive industry, there's a few companies out there like General Motors that can just send a notice out saying we've just moved your payment terms from 30 to 90 days. And when you're in an industry where a lot of your vendors are single source, so you're their only client, you have some negotiating leverage there. Most of us don't live in that world. So we can negotiate longer payment terms, but we have to understand the cost implications of doing so. And that's where really analytics can come in. This is a very basic example that obviously if you add 30 days to your payment terms, you're going to get the value of that capital for 30 days. What the next logical step there is, what is that capital costing me as a company for that 30 days? And if that's less than the value you're getting, then you renegotiate to the 60-day terms.
Yeah, so even if it's even 10 days, it might not be 30 days, but if you're getting 1 million and your return on capital employed is 5%, and you then cede a 1% kind of increase in rent, you're still net up by 4.
Exactly.
Plus the sort of one-time benefit. So, and I think that's the question there comes back to one of your earlier points is, but who owns that negotiation? Is that procurement? Is it legal? That's where it gets confused, I think.
Well, and that's going to differ from company to company, but if there's more expectation of legal departments to add commercial value, and this is one very easy way for you to get into the mix of that and start doing that.
Yeah, and Gordon, if we move on to the next slide, just to come back to the property example, one of the things that we've looked at in that portfolio is this is maybe a legal insight, is the variety of escalation clauses. And it may be by local market, but actually some of the more simple things to understand, which is the rent goes up by X per annum, gets very, very confused and is very variable. Do you think is that unusual? I certainly don't think this is unusual to you guys.
Well, and leases are one of those where local markets can have a sizable influence on acceptable terms. So if you're negotiating against landlords who live in that local market, what you're able to negotiate in New York and they're sitting in Albuquerque, they really don't care probably. But it again, when you're looking at it, it's really not something we had global visibility into, because again, we were doing analytics and leases. We were bringing in our real estate broker. They were telling us average cost per square foot. They were telling us what the local terms were. We were looking at it very market-centrically.
So do you think, as a takeaway for the audience, sort of visibility and control is really what it's about?
Well, looking at it across a larger geographic scope, again, your insights may be rationalized away, but you're now asking the questions. So why are my escalation clauses higher here relative to here? And if the answer is simply, well, you negotiated a lower rent in year one, or the market dictates that and the rents reflect that, then you have your answer. But the other answer could be, well, maybe you should have pressed harder on that point, right? But you're at least asking the right questions.
I think the next example, Gordon, if we could have that up, is another real example from a financial services institution. You spend about $750 million, but that's with a B, per annum on IT spend with some 6,000 contracts. Now, even to make a 1% improvement on there by gathering the data properly, it should be doable. I mean, you've obviously seen this now for a little while. What are your sort of views on this?
Well, knee-jerk, it made me feel better about our IT spend. But this being a financial services company, it's not surprising. And banks are going to view IT security spend differently than most other organizations out there, and they may argue there cannot be a cost that is too high relative to the commercial risk. So I think looking at this, there's obviously a lot more opportunity there when you have $700 million of spend. If you take 5% off of that, that's a much bigger number than if you have $100 million of spend, obviously.
That's a lunch, John.
But this, at least a couple of lunches, yeah. But this may get to the point where they ultimately decide the commercial risk justifies the expenditure. Odds are, though, there's opportunities here, and they're now asking those questions.
Yeah, I mean, we sat in a room with procurement and legal, and they were virtual strangers on this particular sort of area. They're like, they hadn't really thought of it as an asset class. And here's another, without telling tales out of school, because it's unnamed, the perception internally was that 75% of the contracts were on bank paper and 25% on supplier paper. It turns out, having been through several thousand contracts now, that it's the other way around.
And that's the point you would miss if you're looking at contracts in isolation. Yeah. And most companies probably do. You negotiate the contract, and you put it in a drawer, and if there's a problem, you pull it out of the drawer. This exercise in having a contracts management platform and extracting all of that data, you're going to look at those contracts on a more regular basis, and you're going to understand that your perception may not be 100% accurate.
Yeah, I mean, to think that you thought 75% was on your paper, and in fact it was 25. Just that single sat alone, that exercise alone, has opened some eyes to more potential risk.
And that may be, an extreme swing, but those misses, even of a sizable magnitude, are not uncommon.
Right. Gordon, I think we're going to go straight to the second poll, so I'm cognizant of time. If we go straight to the poll. So if people would just take a look at that and express a thought. John, one of the things that has really interested me is, forget this poll for a second, what's your recommendation to the audience about seeking help, either internally or externally? Do you think this is something that law departments can do on their own?
Effectively, well, yes, they could do it on their own, but if they want to be most effective, they should partner. And if you're looking at vendor agreements as your starting point and you have a procurement department, they're the logical point to partner. In the example you just gave on the financial services group, it didn't sound like they were regularly talking. Yes is the short answer. They could do it on their own, but they would probably find themselves being far more effective in finding strategic partners within their organization.
Well, hopefully there's no more than sort of 1% apocalyptic, but so we have pretty much the results in, and I think 75% of people support that. And I think, the takeaway for us is that to get this right, there's a mix of skills. There's some IT skills, there's some finance skills, and some procurement, and collaboration's the real key to success sort of in this area. So I think we are slightly running out of time. If we can go to the final slide, Gordon. So, John, a couple of sort of wrap-up points from you. Thank you very much for joining us. If you wanted to leave people with 3 kind of insights or suggestions, what would your top 3 be?
This is something everyone should be talking about. If you look at the survey results, it doesn't have to happen tomorrow. And if you rush out of the gate, you misstep, you may do more damage to the long-term prospects of success than if you take a more measured approach. So those survey results didn't surprise me, and I think they're well-reasoned if you look at it. But you have to start. You have to start somewhere. You have to start now. Logically, you have to understand the body of contracts you're going to focus in on, who you're going to partner with internally. Those are your early steps. Then you move into selecting the platform and identifying the data strategy, the data you're going to extract, the data you're going to analyze, and what you're looking to understand from that data.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks again for today. I I think we're about to wrap up, but if people, I think there's a kind of satisfaction survey at the end, which votes on how brilliant you've been today, John. Appreciate it massively. Over to you, Gordon. Thank you very much for tuning in, everyone.
Thank you, John. Thank you, David. And thank you, everyone, for listening in and also asking a few questions towards the end. I'm not sure whether we have maybe just a minute to try to one part of the question. Manage and analyze the contract data, e.g. knowing that what data to collect and which questions to ask the data. Do you think there is a skill gap among in-house lawyers?
We missed some of the question, actually, Gordon, but I think the question was, is there a skill gap in in-house lawyers? Controversial.
I mean, invariably, some lawyers are going to be more in tune with this and have more experience in it than others. But it is something, again, every lawyer should be looking at and should be seeking to better understand. And again, if it's not something you haven't done before or you're less comfortable with, your first project may be a little less ambitious. And maybe you start with your law firm agreements or something a little closer to home, because when you start to understand the process, it is going to differ when you move from legal fixed fee agreements or whatever you're looking at to leases, but some of the methodology is the same.
Yeah, I mean, our observation from our fantastic group of attorneys is it's partly generational. I think we're finding more curiosity around this in the kind of gen, whatever, I've lost track of which gen we're on now, but the kind of 20 to 30-year-olds, there's much more curiosity.
The millennials.
That's it. Thanks, John. So, does that answer your question, Gordon?
Yes, there is. Catherine's question has a second part as well, a couple of other questions, but we will, as promised, follow up on any questions that you can send us either through this questions box on your right-hand panel or through some of the other means that you can see on the screen. You can send us your questions via LinkedIn at exigent-global or via Twitter at exigent_group, or you can send your questions directly to David or John, emails you see on your screen. And of course, after this webinar, a few days' time, we will be sending you the recording of this webinar to your email as a link. So thank you again for joining us today. Fantastic audience from all over the world. Thank you, David and John, for your knowledge and expertise and interesting discussion. And I hope to see you again soon at one of our forthcoming webinars. Thank you again for your time.